All right, so this next screencast from Chapter 5 is dealing with the ear, kind of a pretty intense, up-close, grody picture of the ear, so we'll move on. Our ear, or our hearing, our sense of hearing is referred to as audition. Our auditory sense also uses the form of waves, but instead of electromagnetic waves, they use sound waves. They are vibrations in the air. They're bands of compressed and expanded air. So hearing is a special form, actually, of touch sensation. All right. When we think of the sense of hearing, we need to understand that the unit for measuring sound is measured in decibels. And we have to understand that the frequency is the number of complete wavelengths that pass a point in a given time, for example, per second. So it's important for us to understand that decibels and the rate of decibels, like every 10 decibels corresponds to a tenfold increase in sound. If you look at the chart on the right, it's kind of scary to think about how prolonged exposure above 85 decibels can actually produce hearing loss. And that's like that of a busy street corner. Normal conversation, 60 decibels. So all of those loud noises that you are exposed to, whether you're in the marching band, whether you are listening to music with your earbuds at a very loud volume, it's kind of scary to think about what the long-term effects might be with prolonged exposure. When you look at this next chart, it's a familiar one. We used it when we talked about vision. And now we're looking at it with our sense of audition or hearing. And when you look at the left-hand side, we look at how the shorter the wavelength, the distance from peak to peak, the higher pitch you experience. So pitch is a tone's experienced highness or lowness, and it does depend on frequency. So like I mentioned, the higher the frequency, the higher pitch sound. The lower the frequency, which is again the distance from one peak to the next, the lower pitch sounds you perceive. I go back, whoops. Then in addition to the frequency, you also look at amplitude when it comes to audition or hearing. And when you look on the right-hand side of this chart, you can see that loud sounds are generated by great amplitude, and softer sounds are generated by smaller amplitude. All right, when we take a look at the outer and the middle ear and the inner ear, we start with simply collecting the sound waves. Your outer ear is simply the visible portion of your ear, and the sound waves are collected. Now, if a person didn't have an outer ear, they still would be able to hear. They just don't have the localization accuracy and being able to detect where the sound is coming from. So the sound waves are collected by your outer ear, and they travel down the ear canal to the middle ear. The middle ear is the chamber between your eardrum and your cochlea. And through a mechanical chain of events, sound waves travel through the auditory canal, and they cause these just minuscule vibrations in the eardrum. So your middle ear include the bones, the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. And the middle ear amplifies these vibrations, and they relay them to the fluid-filled cochlea. So it really is, this mechanical chain of events. And you almost take this process for granted, and these tiny little bones really affect your ability to perceive sound. So your inner ear consists of the cochlea, the semicircular canals, and the vestibular sacs. Now these all three contain fluid. So the vibrations that are collected in the outer ear, they travel into the middle ear. The middle ear bones vibrate, and then once it hits the cochlea, this transduction of conversion of energy from one to the next, sound waves to neural signals, changes in the fluid-filled inner ear. This next picture shows you the lining of the cochlea, and it contains thousands of tiny hair cells, and the cochlea has about 16,000 of these. Now, unfortunately, if these cilia or hair cells are damaged, they do not regenerate. And most hearing loss actually is caused by damage to the cilia, damage to the hair cells. So when the pressure changes in the cochlear fluid, it causes the movement of these tiny hair cells, and this is what triggers the neural messages to be sent, again, via the thalamus to the auditory cortex of the brain, which is our temporal lobe. There are two hearing theories that deal with audition, and we need both of them to understand how we hear high-pitched sounds and how we hear low-pitched sounds. The place theory is the theory that links the pitch we hear with the place where the cochlea's membrane is stimulated. So if you think of those cilia kind of like a wheat field, wherever the cilia are bent in the cochlea is where we perceive high pitches. And I have it obviously in uppercase letters. The word high is underlined. So wherever in the cochlea the cilia bend or are stimulated is the pitch we perceive. And it typically is only the high-pitched noises or sounds that we perceive. The frequency theory explains how we hear low-pitched sounds. And the place that holds, the theory that it's the theory that the rate of nerve impulses traveling up the auditory nerve matches the frequency of a tone. And that's what allows us to sense pitch. So I think that's what's really important, is that high-pitched sounds are perceived by the place theory, and low-pitched sounds are perceived by the frequency theory. In terms of hearing loss, there are really two types, conduction and sensory neural. The one that we oftentimes are more exposed to, and the ones that is probably more common, is sensory hearing loss. It's also referred to as nerve deafness. Now, this is hearing loss caused by damage to the cilia, and it's oftentimes caused by simply aging, prolonged exposure to really loud noises, or even music. Conduction hearing loss is hard and frustrating, and unfortunately, conduction hearing loss oftentimes is not repairable, and it has to do with damage to the middle ear bones, the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. Punctured eardrums sometimes can cause conduction hearing loss, and like I said before, the middle ear tiny bones, the hammer, the anvil, or stirrup, having damage to them. One section in our book talks about cochlear implants. Now these allow for hearing impaired or deaf individuals to be able to hear. And it basically does the work of neural transmission in the cochlea, where the cilia would start that neural signal to the thalamus via the thalamus to the temporal lobe. It converts the electrical signals by stimulating the auditory nerve through different electrodes that are threaded into the cochlea. So this is a surgical procedure where the electrodes are threaded into the cochlea, and then there is a device that is placed on the outside of the ear, and it is on the scalp. and it's attached through a magnet, and it allows for the sound to be amplified and to be heard. It's a pretty awesome, these series of YouTube videos that you see are pretty awesome, and if you get a chance, you should watch them. Helps you understand how it works. And that's it for the ear.